A large norovirus outbreak has suddenly hit China, and a college has been placed on partial lockdown to stop the spread of this highly contagious virus. Meanwhile, CCP leader Xi Jinping has joined Karl Marx and Mao Zedong as a required course at the top colleges in China. I'll be going into this. And the Vatican is working to renew its deal with the Chinese Communist Party, and this is raising concerns about the Vatican increasingly siding with communist ideologies. I'll be speaking with James Bascom about this. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. There was a large norovirus outbreak at a Chinese university in Shanxi, where around 100 male college students suddenly fell ill with the food-borne illness. Now, there was very little information on what was taking place until the evening of October 8th, when the Wucheng campus of Shanxi University of Finance and Economics briefly confirmed the norovirus outbreak on a post on its Weibo account. According to the Epoch Times, the school announced that all students on the 6th floor of a dormitory building have been placed in isolation in their dorms due to the outbreak. Now, details on this are still thin. We're not really getting a lot of information out of China right now. Different students at the dormitory have spoken with Epoch Times in phone interviews, and they've detailed a little bit of what's happening there. The CCP, at least the branch there, does appear to have allowed some information out, possibly, very likely, because there's some interest in it from the public. They released just the minimum amount to satisfy public interest. Now, taken from another standpoint, if the students are being placed in isolation, it could mean that they're very concerned about the virus spreading. 100 students falling ill is no small number when it comes to a virus outbreak, and it does seem to be localized if, for example, it's just the 6th floor of this dormitory. We'll have to see if the isolation of these students is going to actually stop that spread. And the other side of this, Chinese officials oftentimes put on a show when it comes to trying to make themselves look good so they can get promotions. They often overreact to incidents, or underreact depending on how big the issue is. If there's public attention on something like this, it's getting foreign news coverage right now, which means it's making the CCP look bad, which means the local officials need to demonstrate to higher level officials that they care about it, that they're doing something about it. And so in this case, they are more likely to overreact in order to send a message to high-level officials that they're doing everything they possibly can in order to stop this thing that is damaging the image of the Chinese Communist Party. And so it's unclear what's happening right now. It could be either of these. It could be a combination of both. Again, we'll keep you updated as it goes forward. Now, meanwhile, with the disasters in China, the regime's Ministry of Emergency Management declared that 130 million people in the country were affected by natural disasters in the first 3 quarters of 2020. Now, it's saying that only 578 people were killed or are missing. Based on numbers we've seen, it's very likely a lot higher than that, but I'll explain. They're also saying about 189 million hectares of crops were affected, which included about 25 million hectares that are non-harvestable from the disasters. It also estimated the economic cost is around $46 billion. Now, when it comes to this, the Chinese Communist Party's official numbers are rarely accurate. You can almost never believe what their numbers state, especially when they tie to the image of the Chinese Communist Party. If high numbers make the CCP look bad, they're not going to show those high numbers. If high numbers make the CCP look good, they're going to exaggerate them. This is how it does things. And this is even more so, again, when it ties to issues of social stability. This is something impacting the food supplies in China. This is something impacting people's housing, people's jobs, which means this is an issue of social stability. The Chinese Communist Party and every local official in China is going to have interest in covering this up as much as they can, which means now the CCP is releasing numbers on these disasters, very likely because the whole world is watching. This means the CCP is trying to, one, signal to the world that it's doing something about it, that acknowledging something did happen, while at the same time trying to keep those numbers low enough so it does not impact social stability. Now, again, we'll keep you updated as we get more information on this and get more accurate information on the numbers. And also, there's some more information on the food situation in China. As we mentioned before, they're facing floods, they're facing droughts, they have locusts, they have many other issues impacting the food supplies in China. And now the Guangdong granary was allegedly storing 2,500 tons of poisonous rice. Some individuals tied to it have been sentenced to between 1 and 5 years in prison for their involvement. There are around 2,000 tons of rice contaminated with the heavy metal cadmium that's used in batteries. Now, what are we seeing? The Chinese Communist Party typically only takes actions like this, going after corruption at lower levels of government, if it's something that impacts public image, if it's something in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, let's look at a few different elements of this. On one side, is it in the CCP's interest to talk about food being poisoned? Is it in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party to talk about, say, low-level officials involved in, money-making schemes polluting the country's food supplies? No, definitely not. So why would they say this at that time, especially when food supplies and concerns around food security are increasing in China? Why would they do this? Well, my analysis on this is this. The Chinese Communist Party is aware there's an issue with food security. They need to make it look like they're doing something about it. They need to make it look like they're going after corrupt low-level officials. They need to make it look like this is not something the CCP itself is responsible for, and make it look like the CCP is the responsible body in this. And so they take different low-level officials, make them the sacrificial lambs to maintain the party interest and the party image. When they go after corrupt local officials like this, keep in mind in China, most Chinese Communist Party officials are corrupt. If you're going to do business in China, you have to get involved in some level of corruption. There's almost no way around it. When it comes to these low-level officials embezzling funds, when it comes to these low-level officials getting money out of the country, when it comes to the way they get promoted, all this often ties to corruption. The Chinese Communist Party can go after any of these officials at any time they want. And so when they do go after them, typically it means there's something broader taking place. Now, meanwhile, Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping has joined Karl Marx and Mao Zedong, the former chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, as a required course at some of the top colleges in China. Nikkei reports that starting this fall, 37 universities, including some of the major ones, will launch introductory courses on Xi Jinping Thought. This will be done through the School of Marxism, which is an institution at the 37 universities, and instructs students on the theories of the Communist Party. Now, a lot of people say the Chinese Communist Party is no longer communist, because again, they brought in elements of state capitalism, we could call it socialism, essentially, where the state controls the different state-run industries. They have large corporations with partial or full state control. Now, when you're a CCP member in China, and if you come to any levels of success, if you're a government official, if you're a top businessman, you have to become a CCP member. You have to join the Chinese Communist Party. And if you do that, it means a few things. You have to join weekly study sessions. You have to pay your dues. These weekly study sessions mean they're studying communist texts. They're studying Marx, they're studying Mao, they're studying Xi Jinping. And this ties to something bigger taking place in China right now. The Chinese Communist Party is trying to reinvigorate communist thought. They're trying to lock down the system of communism, what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics. Xi Jinping is walking the same road that Mao Zedong walked when he was establishing his role as chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. He's launching internal purges. He's launching this new mixed ownership model of businesses, meaning they're increasing state ownership over even small and medium businesses. And so what are they doing? They're reinvigorating communist thought. They're not just studying older theories of Mao Zedong and Karl Marx, things up to more than 100 years old at this point. They're studying now Xi Jinping. And you might have remembered some of our previous episodes. We talked about how they're enshrining statues of Communist Party leaders such as Mao Zedong and his wife in different parts of China. They're bringing back party worship. They're reinvigorating all the systems of communist thought in China. All the things we saw under Mao Zedong, they're trying to remake as we speak. This again ties into the broader trajectory of where the CCP is likely heading. They're trying to protect the CCP at a time when the country is facing crisis from many directions. They want to make sure the Chinese Communist Party itself is able to weather this time period. What that means for the Chinese people very likely will mean what it meant under Mao Zedong, that they will be the sacrificial lambs to keep the party alive. Now, in other news, the United States is aiming to shake up China's influence in the Southeast Asian region. This is through a new partnership to aid Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, also known as Burma, Thailand, and Vietnam. Now, all of these countries have been historically dependent on the Chinese Communist Party to different degrees for financial support. The U.S. has had less engagement in this area. Now, this is called the Mekong-U.S. Partnership. It will bring U.S. pandemic relief to these 5 Southeast Asian countries. And what are we seeing here? The way the Chinese Communist Party would view this is a direct incursion by U.S. forces, as they would say it, into their direct territory, into their backyard. The Chinese Communist Party is always trying to accuse the United States of trying to encircle it, of the CCP's enemies encircling China. What are we seeing? Well, now we have all of Southeast Asia, if this program works. We have Japan, we have Korea, South Korea at least. We have Taiwan, we have Australia. Different countries surrounding China, all opposing it in their own different ways. The Chinese Communist Party, through this virus and through its own system of what they called wolf warrior diplomacy, where they had this hard-line stance on other countries, has pushed many of these countries away from China. Many countries in that region now are pushing back harder against the CCP. And also as the One Belt, One Road initiative is going forward, this program where they're going into these countries, building these infrastructure projects and getting them stuck in debt traps, where they indefinitely owe the Chinese Communist Party a lot of times, and the CCP takes over local infrastructure in exchange. They're seeing now the deceptive nature of the Chinese Communist Party, and they're looking for a way out. And the United States, through this program, at the very least, is beginning a process providing these countries a way out by allowing them, we could say, to side with the United States as the U.S. takes a very strong stance against China, and as the U.S. is building alliances with India, Japan, and Australia against the Chinese Communist Party, and looking to expand that alliance. If that alliance grows to include these Southeast Asian countries, China is going to be very unhappy about that. Meanwhile, there are some news updates on the Crossfire hurricane case in the United States, where those behind the rumors that Trump had colluded with Russia in the 2016 elections are now themselves being investigated for possible crimes. Now, Trump announced in an October 6 tweet that he has authorized the complete declassification of all documents on the Russia investigations, which he referred to as the, quote, single greatest political crime in American history. And also documents on the Hillary Clinton email scandal as well will be allegedly declassified. Trump's tweet was issued in response to another tweet by Hoover Institute media fellow and author Paul Sperry, who wrote that when all the documents are declassified and all the redactions are removed, quote, the nation will see that the FBI and CIA not only knew the Russian collusion allegations against Trump were a political dirty trick, but that they were in on the trick. On October 7th, Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe announced that his office released 1,000 pages of documents to John Durham, the federal prosecutor investigating the conduct of U.S. intelligence agencies during the Russia scandal. This does give some credence to the idea that maybe they are moving forward with Trump's order to declassify the documents ahead of the elections. Now, Ratcliffe said in a statement that he's ensuring the intelligence community is cooperating with the Department of Justice on the document requests, and stated, quote, as the President has made clear, we must be appropriately transparent with the American people and give them the confidence that the extraordinary work of intelligence professionals is never misused or politicized. Among the documents recently declassified by the Director of National Intelligence was a CIA memo that former FBI Director James Comey claimed to have no memory of receiving. The partially redacted 3-page referral was sent by Ratcliffe to the Senate intelligence community alongside notes that had been taken by former CIA Director John Brennan. The Epoch Times reports that the documents say then Democrat presidential nominee Hillary Clinton had created a plan to distract public attention from the Clinton email scandal by manufacturing a new scandal tying Trump to Russia. The notes from John Brennan also state there was a, quote, alleged approval by Hillary Clinton on 26 July of a proposal from one of her foreign policy advisors to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by the Russia security services. That was Brennan's statement in his notes. And the notes also suggest that Comey and then President Barack Obama were alerted of this. Now, following this, the Trump campaign is now calling on Democrat presidential nominee Joe Biden to disclose any knowledge he has about the findings on Hillary Clinton planning to create the Trump-Russia scandal in order to distract from her email scandal. Tim Murtaugh, Trump 2020 communications director, said in a statement that voters should be made aware if Biden knew about the scheme. He said in the statement, quote, Biden must give a full accounting of his knowledge about his conversations about Clinton's scheme, which was known to the highest reaches of his administration. The Epoch Times reports that the Biden campaign did not immediately respond to a request for comment, and also Clinton did not respond to a request for comment. Now, as this unfolds, former CIA Director John Brennan is accusing the Trump administration of using declassification of agency records for political gain. He said during an October 6 interview with CNN that the declassifications are, quote, designed to advance the political interests of Donald Trump and Republicans who are aligned with him. Brennan said his newly declassified notes were about a briefing he gave to President Barack Obama at that time and the National Security Council about, quote, what the Russians were up to. And meanwhile, the Senate is also moving forward now with its investigations into the Trump-Russia scandal. It's now issued a subpoena for Stefan Halper, who was one of the spies used by the FBI in its Russia investigations back in 2016. Halper has been asked to testify in Washington on October 20th. Meanwhile, the Vatican is in the process of renewing its deal with the Chinese Communist Party that recognizes CCP-appointed bishops as legitimate. This would build on the provisional agreement made with the Chinese Communist Party back in 2018, which was criticized at the time for legitimizing the CCP's altered version of the religion, and also for opening the door for more persecution of Christians and Catholics in China. Now, to learn more about this, we've invited to speak with us James Bascom. He's the Assistant Director of the Washington Bureau of the Catholic organization, the American Society for the Defense of Tradition, Family, and Property. Let's jump into that now. Hey, James Bascom, it's great having you on Crossroads.
Thank you very much, Josh. Good to see you again.
So I know when it comes to China right now, one of the big things happening with Christianity is the Pope, the Catholic Pope, is talking about renewing this deal they had with China. It's just now expiring. They're looking to renew it. There are big questions now around human rights abuses. Will this make things worse for Christians and Catholics in China or better? And number two, what does this really mean for the religion? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's what Pope Francis is doing is very similar to what most of his predecessors have done, going back to Pope John XXIII, and that is to do a rapprochement, do an approaching, a softening of relations between the Vatican and the Catholic Church with communist governments. We saw that in the middle 20th century with Hungary, Soviet Union, Cuba, with Pope Paul VI especially trying to warm relations with these communist regimes with the very naive hope that such warming would lead to greater freedom of religion for Catholics and so forth. If there's anything, if the verdict is certainly in over the last 60 years of this detente with communist regimes, and that is a warming of relations with communist governments leads to greater control, greater persecution of Catholics and Christians in those countries. And in the 2 years since the Vatican Agreement has been implemented between Communist China, Catholics and Christians have seen greater persecution than ever.
I understand one of the big changes now is the Chinese Communist Party is destroying churches, destroying temples. One of the only types of temples that was allowed to stay open in some parts of China during the pandemic was churches that had Mao Zedong and his wife as the figures of worship. And I think a lot of people aren't familiar with this. In China, under the Chinese Communist Party, it functions really like an evil cult. They want you to worship the party leaders, and they actually enshrine them in temples, and they pray to them like gods. I understand that even with the Christian and Catholic churches now, they're starting to bring in elements of this. Have you heard about this?
I have, absolutely. They're demolishing shrines, Catholic shrines. They're forcing, as you alluded to, pictures and imagery of Mao Zedong inside Catholic churches. They're installing closed-circuit television cameras to monitor who comes and who goes at churches. They're banning all Chinese under 18 years of age to even enter churches, to be baptized, to receive sacraments. So what we're seeing is, I think, a fulfillment of what our founder of the organization, Tradition, Family, and Property, his name was Plinio Correa de Oliveira. He wrote a book in 1963 called The Freedom of the Church in the Communist State, The Impossible Coexistence. And among other things, he pointed out that a communist regime only gives limited freedom of religion to a religious group in order to more effectively destroy it later on, to give kind of a semblance of freedom that puts the guard down of the anti-communists and allows them to infiltrate, to penetrate, to take control, and to ultimately destroy. And so very tragically, we're seeing that now in China, as we've saw it in Hungary during the Cold War, in Cuba, they tried to do that in Ukraine and Poland, in Vietnam as well. So it's tragic, but it's not surprising. I think I would say.
We're seeing a couple of different things, I'd say, playing out right now. A few points I want to touch on too. One would be, of course, there's been a shift within the Catholic Church itself. It used to be that if you were a communist, at least for the priests and so on, if you were a communist, you could be excommunicated. And a lot of the early Catholic priests and popes understood that, at least in their words, communism and Christianity, Catholicism, were incompatible with each other. They were incompatible. And the ideas were antithetical to each other. They could not exist in harmony. And we've seen, as you mentioned, anytime a communist system, including the Chinese Communist Party, comes into power, one of the first things it does is targets religions for destruction. And now we're seeing new interpretations of a lot of religions come out. In China, for example, they have these state-run versions of the religions, which ironically now are themselves even facing persecution. But even more so, the people who follow the unregulated versions are facing even heavier persecution. I want to get into these 2 points with you because it does tie into what's happening now with the Pope. I guess first off, though, can you help us understand why popes in the past, why Catholicism in the past, you could, for example, be excommunicated if you were a communist? On what grounds was that understanding?
Well, it's very simple, because the popes of the past, up until basically the Second Vatican Council, saw very clearly that communism was atheistic, was materialistic, was Darwinistic, and ultimately sought the overthrow of civilization and the overthrow of all religion. It was a totalitarian political religion that sought the complete control of society, the re-engineering of society, the re-engineering of man himself, right? The so-called new Soviet man, right, of the 20th century. They wanted to re-engineer, break down, and rebuild man in a completely new image. And so the popes saw that as a vital, a deathly threat to civilization, to the church, to religion, and condemned it many times. Virtually every pope from the 19th century all the way up until Pope Pius XII condemned communism in no uncertain terms. And in fact, at the Second Vatican Council, it was a burning question, a burning kind of a matter. They wanted Pope Paul VI to condemn communism, which he did not, in the name of dialogue, right, with the Soviets. Communism attacks the family. Communism always sought to destroy the monogamous traditional family, traditional marriage, one man and one woman with children, the traditions of society. Communism always sought to destroy the traditions of society, destroy to burn down what came before and to rebuild it anew. And communism also has always sought to destroy private property. Karl Marx made it very clear in the Communist Manifesto that communism can be reduced to a single sentence: the abolition of private property. So there are 2 commandments of the 10 commandments that defend private property. Thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. So Catholics have always been at the forefront of resistance to communism wherever it spread, whether it be in Poland or Hungary or China, Vietnam, Cuba. There have always been a very strong resistance to communism, and that's why the communists themselves have always sought to neutralize that threat by by making deals with Catholic leaders, some of which unfortunately were softer and more malleable than others. But Catholicism was always, as an institution, an obstacle to communist conquest, communist takeover, communist rule.
Now that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And also every Sunday I do a live Q&A, so be sure to join that 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, if you want to support us, please join us on Patreon. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below. If you haven't already also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel. And if you want to go the extra mile, as I always mention, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. And also please consider sharing this video. Now that said, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.